earlier this year, the relics of Saint Therese of Lisieux and her parents, Saint Louis and Saint Zelie Martin, arrived here in Australia for a grand tour. They were going to travel across this vast land for about 4 months, and so they arrived to Western Sydney at the end of January, and with great anticipation they arrived at St Mary's Cathedral in the Archdiocese of Sydney on the weekend of the 1st of February. People flocked to see them in different churches, and then from Sydney they went to Queensland and made their way back to Sydney, and I was very fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to spend a bit of time in prayer with them and before them. But then unfortunately on about the 18th of March the tour had to come to a very abrupt end. Due to all of the restrictions that have been in place, it was no longer possible for the relics to be venerated publicly, and after they were taken care of for a while by the Carmelite sisters in Melbourne, they had to be returned to Lisieux. The words that came to my mind and have come to my mind so often from the prophet Isaiah: "My thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord." It would have been really wonderful for what we had thought to happen, for many people all over Australia to have time to visit the relics and to spend time praying with this Holy Family. But unfortunately, as with so many other things during 2020, plans had to be changed, and that was just not the case. But they're still a very significant, important family, and one I think that's very important for us all to know, for us as Christians, as Catholics, to get to know who are this family. How do we know them? How do we revere them? How do we pray to them? What is it? Why should we? Because really, when we think about this family, the word that really comes to my mind is that it's a very holy family. Of course, there's just one holy family, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, but in terms of fully human families, this family really meets the mark. And there's something that they've been called an exemplary family. Louis and Zelie, in fact, are the first couple to be canonized together as a couple in the Catholic Church. There's something very, very special about who they are, and I think it's something that's really important for us to learn to know how to live our own lives, modelling their lives as a holy family. So Saint Therese was herself, she was probably the first to really recognise the holiness of her own parents. And there's a very famous quote where she says, "The good Lord gave me parents more worthy of heaven than of earth." So what is it that makes Louis and Zelie more worthy of heaven than on earth? Who are this couple? Well, first of all, I would say, let's just look at them as a couple. Louis and Zelie. There's a saying that opposites attract, and this certainly applies to this holy couple. It's kind of known that Louis was quite tall and Zelie was quite short. Also, they had different tastes. Louis really loved travelling, he loved visiting places, he loved going to museums, art galleries, going on pilgrimages. Zelie was a woman who really liked to stay at home. She really dreaded travelling. Also, in terms of their personality, interestingly, Louis was quite a contemplative, he was a very gentlemanly, but quite a quiet, reserved man, whereas Zelie was in fact a very vivacious. She was kind of the life and soul of the family when she was at home. She worked very hard, and she also loved to teach, she had a good sense of humour. And also interestingly, when the two met, Zelie was determined to get married and have children, but at that point, Louis was convinced that he was just going to remain a bachelor. So those are some of the differences, but importantly, there's something which they really shared that was the same for both of them, and that was their great and very deep faith and their love of the will of God. In fact, also both had been attracted to become religious, but both of them had, for different reasons, been rejected from the convents and monasteries that they'd applied to. And I suppose that's fortunate for us. But there's something about that desire that reveals about who they are as people, that they really wanted to make God be at the centre of their lives. So this great deep love for God, of his will, that's really at the centre of each of their lives and at the centre of their family life as well. And we were told at the homily at the beatification, the cardinal who preached said that they were passionate disciples of Jesus. And they give us an exemplary testimony of conjugal love. So for both of them, we can say that the sanctity wasn't ideal. It wasn't just a kind of a nice idea that other people might be called to be holy. No. Both Louis and Zelie really strove to be holy. And Zelie was able to recognise this desire in her husband. And we have a lot of her letters that she wrote to different people, many of them in fact to her own brother. And she said to him on one occasion, "I am always so happy with him. He makes my life very pleasant. What a holy man my husband is. I wish the same for all women." So if you're a young woman looking for a husband, perhaps you might want to ask Saint Zelie to help you to find a good one and a holy one. So let's look at their lives a little bit. Let yourselves be challenged, but also let yourselves be inspired. Because after all, holiness is a calling for everybody. We're all called as Christians, as baptized, to be holy. We need to cultivate in our hearts the seed that has been placed within us. We don't necessarily need to do exactly the same things in our lives as Louis and Zelie did, but we can learn from them in their attitude to life, their love of God, and how they made their decisions, and how ultimately they made God be the priority over everything else. So let's look at each of their lives. So Louis Martin, we need to go back about 200 years. For some people that might sound like a very long time ago, but in the history of humanity, let's be honest, it's not very long ago at all. Louis was born in August of 1823 in Bordeaux, a famous French town city, I suppose, in southwestern France. And just 6 days later, his parents took him to be baptized. He was the third of what would be 5 children. His father was in the military. He's also known for being a very religious and devout man. And so there's something that Louis really learnt from his own home, from his own father. And there's a famous quotation that his father was asked, "Why is it, Mr. Martin, that you pray, that you kneel for so long?" And he just replied, "Tell them that it is because I believe." So faith in the Blessed Sacrament, in the Eucharist, was really at the heart of this family. And Louis' upbringing was therefore very religious. He was fortunate in that way, both also not just at home but also at school. And his friends would comment that he was known as a saintly individual. Even though it might have been normal for him to enter the military just as his father did, that wasn't his profession. He actually became a watchmaker. He was very dexterous, so it suited him, both his natural skill but also his contemplative nature. So he lived initially with his parents in Brittany, in the town of Alençon. That's significant, and it's a town which is famous for its lace. Religion was important for him too. It wasn't just something that his parents had. And as from a young age, he himself made a vow that he would never work on Sunday. And interestingly, even though at the time it started to be common for people to work on Sundays, and even sometimes priests would promote that to help people financially, Louis was always very strict. He preferred to earn less, but to keep the Sabbath day holy. And this was something that really was instilled in him from a young age. And there was, as he grew up, and he was a young man in his 20s, he was able to buy himself a pavilion. So it's like a building that he liked to fish, and so he had this fishing pavilion behind near the river. And it didn't have very much furniture, it just kind of revealed a little bit about him. It had a place on the ground floor. It was 3 floors on the ground floor for all of his fishing equipment. And then upstairs there was a private oratory, and on the top floor there was a bed. So he had space, he could relax, lead his balanced lifestyle. So Zelie. Zelie was born in 1831, so that makes her about 8 years younger than Louis. She was the second of 3 children. Similarly, her family was religious, but her mother, who had a great influence on her, was very, very strict. And she could actually be quite rigid and cold, and that had a big effect on Zelie, on her upbringing. She was very rarely hugged by her mother. She didn't really receive much affection from her. And Zelie was very sensitive, and this really kind of hurt her, and she talks about it later on, and she suffered because of that. And her younger brother, Isidore, the one that she writes all her letters to, he was like her mother's favourite child. But we'll see that even though he was kind of spoilt by the mother, that didn't affect how Zelie felt towards her brother, and she loved him very dearly. And in fact, also something I think that's important to learn from Zelie is that even though that she was brought up in this kind of strict and cold way, she didn't copy that with her own children. She's very well known for being very gentle with each of her children, being very attentive to each of their needs, worrying about them, being concerned for them. So sometimes, yes, I think if we think about it, if we see our siblings getting treated differently from how we're treated by our parents, that might make us resentful or upset. But if we turn to Zelie, we can learn from her that that's not actually an excuse. There's absolutely no reason to be resentful. There's no reason to build up animosity towards other people. Certain things happen to us and they can be sufferings for us, but ultimately what we need is healing. And so I think that in a circumstance like this one, St. Zelie is perhaps a good intercessor for us. Her elder sister was a visitation nun, and Zelie wanted to follow her into that convent. As I said, she felt a calling and she desired to go. She loved God deeply, and so she saw how her sister loved God and entered the convent, so she thought she would do the same. So when she presented herself, unfortunately, the Mother Superior rejected her outright and just simply told her, Mademoiselle Zelie, you haven't got a vocation, or words to that effect. I can't think of the profound pain at that rejection. But similarly, we can learn from Zelie. How did she react? Well, sometimes things just are totally out of our hands. We want to do something very good. In this case, Zelie wanted to serve the Lord as a nun for all her life. But sometimes the decisions are out of our hands. Other people might be able to see better, and we have to trust them. We have to accept them. So, how did Zelie respond to this painful rejection? We have from one of her letters that she said, Lord, since unlike my sister I am not worthy to be your bride, I will enter the married state in order to fulfill your holy will. I beg of you to give me many children and to let them all be consecrated to you. So those are powerful words, and we'll see how God helped to bring them to fulfillment. So Zelie had this nostalgia for the cloister. It's well known that she yearned for religious life during her life, but that doesn't actually mean that she didn't embrace her vocation to marriage to the full. So let's look a little bit at her life and how she responded. If we put ourselves into her shoes, at that moment she had thought she was going to enter the convent. She'd set her hopes on that, serving God as a nun for all of her life, but suddenly the plans changed. So what does any good Catholic girl do? She prays to Our Lady. She needed help. And on December the 8th, 1881, which is of course a great Marian feast day, Zelie had a very strong sense of receiving an instruction from Our Lady that she was going to become a lace maker. She was from the town of Alençon, which is famous for its lace, and lace is a very intricate art, lace making. It's very delicate, it requires a lot of training and a lot of dedication. But that is what Zelie did. She trained, she set up a business, she also taught at a school, and she was pretty successful. And in this chronology of her life, of course, let's just think about one of her students, who of course was one of her students, but Mrs. Martin Senior, so Louis's mother. And Louis's mother was concerned for her son, who didn't seem to be getting married. That didn't please her especially, and she saw this nice, well-mannered young lady, and she thought that she'd make a good match for her son. But Zelie wasn't interested in what this lady thought, at least not then. But God's ways are not our ways, and around that same time, around March of 1858, when Zelie was about 26 years old, she was out and she was walking across the bridge in Alençon, and she walked past a man. And she had this sense interiorly, and she heard like an inner voice, "This is he whom I have prepared for you." Well, lo and behold, it was Louis, and the two became friends, They liked each other, they got engaged, they had a religious betrothal ceremony, and within about 3 months they were married. So on the 13th of July 1858. So let's look at their married life a little bit. So in the first 10 months of their marriage, Louis and Zelie lived as brother and sister. Louis wanted his life to be very spiritual, and he actually wanted to physically resemble the Holy Family of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. But after a while, a priest counselled them against this. And the priest pointed out to them that it's not just about having children in order to populate the earth, but in fact the very act of coming together, that it actually enables them to express their conjugal union, the love that binds them together, and is what brings them towards God. And that is something that's very important, how it is marriage that sanctifies them. And years later, Zelie would actually say that she wanted many children in order to bring them up for heaven, and that their life changed when they had children. She said, when we had our children, our ideas changed somewhat. Thenceforward, we lived only for them. They made all our happiness, and we would never have found it save in them. In fact, nothing any longer cost us anything. The world was no longer a burden to us. As for me, my children were my great compensation, so that I wish to have many in order to bring them all up for heaven. What does it mean? What is she saying here, bringing up children for heaven? Is that really possible? I have some friends who have children. They're a very Catholic family, and they're very concerned about the environment that they live in here in Sydney 2020. Their children go to Catholic school, but they get picked on for being Catholic. Their children want to pray, they want to live religious lives, but that's not really considered very cool in the schoolyard. And so sometimes we could be tempted to think that today's world, it's impossible, it's too dangerous, that we're not like France in the 19th century when Louis and Zelie were around, so their example is a bit of nothing for us. And it is true that there are challenges that we have today that Louis and Zelie did not have. Perhaps they didn't have the challenges of how to deal with social media or the world around us, that the world tells us that it's normal for a child to have two dads, for example. How do I explain that to my children? And it's also true that Louis and Zelie were able to send their children to Catholic school, and that they knew that they would receive a good Catholic education. But they also lived in a world that was pretty dangerous. It was the time of separation of church and state. There was a lot of political and civil disturbance at the time. And at the end of the day, the world is the world. Temptation is temptation. Sin is sin. The desire for worldly goods over heavenly goods, that's been around forever. We can just go back to Adam and Eve. So it's not really worthwhile if we make excuses that our times are too difficult. That just shows that we don't really know anything about history. Because ultimately, if we do that, what we're saying is that Jesus has not overcome the world, and that it's just impossible what he's preaching, which I think that's a pretty difficult way to go. So let's just look at Louis and Zelie and see how they dealt with their specific difficulties, and we can see what we can learn from them, how to deal with difficulties, how to deal with challenging circumstances in the world. So over the next 4 years, the family had 4 girls, and they started. Let's start again. Sorry. So Louis and Zelie got married. No. They got married and they've had a. Oh yeah. So as Louis and Zelie started to have children, they had 4 girls over 4 years, and as the family started to grow, they also started to instill various family traditions. The first and most important tradition was that Our Lady was the patroness of their family, and that was shown in a very particular way, that they chose that all of their children would be called Marie, so the French for Mary, even their boys. They would have a second name that would be chosen by their godparents, and so then that's what they were actually called. And even their son was called Marie, but Joseph. So we can see that the Holy Family was very present. The other very important family tradition was their dedication to God. So that's shown by the fact that Louis and Zelie baptized their children pretty much immediately after they were born. They would go to Mass as often as they could on a daily basis at 5:30 in the morning. They would pray the Rosary as a family. As I said, no work was done on Sundays. Basically, God's will was law for this family. So that's something that we can all ask ourselves. How much is God's law, the will, for my family? How often do I really ponder what it means to take the Sabbath day holy? So we can ask ourselves, how much is God's will the rule for my life, for my family life? How often do I really ponder on what the third commandment means? You shall keep holy the Sabbath day. What does that mean? Just go to Mass? Perhaps just watch Mass on TV? Or does it really mean refrain from all worldly activities? Really focus on God all day long. Make it Sunday be different from the rest of the week. We need to pay attention to what God is saying to us through his commandments, through the church, through our own consciences. And that is what Louis did. A priest had told him that it was okay to work on a Sunday, but he knew that if he did so, he'd be breaking a commandment. He also knew that the church had rules about fasting. These days, in general, we're much more lax on that, but Louis took these rules very seriously and wouldn't give himself a reprieve. So, for example, they had some social engagement and it was a fasting day, and he would eat very little. It was no excuse. And so some people ask, what did Zelie think about all of this? Maybe she just went along, her husband forced it on her. But in fact, she agreed with it all. And she encouraged her sister-in-law also to keep the same rule about keeping the Sabbath day holy. All the faithful observers of the Lord's day, she wrote to her, perfect or imperfect, succeed in their businesses. And in the end, one way or another, they become rich. And she also speaks of how her husband behaved. I can't attribute the affluence he enjoys to anything other than a special blessing, the fruit of his faithful observance of Sunday. So sometimes it can be challenging to follow God's law, but we can see from Zelie how she really knows that God blesses those who follow him. And keeping the commandments is not something that's external, but it's something that's very much internal, that must be very much part of our lives. So aside from these specific religious activities, the Martin family life was also marked with this unwritten motto: do the little things and the hard things with much love. And if we look at their family, we see that it was a big combination of Christian charity and joy in all things, much love in everything. So how did they live? So education was important, studies were important, they had means enough to be able to do that. They also were able to cultivate their spirits. They would go to the fair, to shows, to different cultural activities. They'd also gather and sing together as a family. They'd go out for walks together. They also practiced a lot of Christian charity, bringing poor people into their homes, giving them meals. They would also give big donations to the propagation of the faith. Louis Martin, he also insisted that bills be paid immediately. He had a very strong sense that it's unjust to keep people waiting for something that is owed to them. And he'd learned that from being aware of a lady who, basically, he learned that she starved to death because she wasn't able to pay her own debts because her creditors weren't paying her. And so that really struck him, and he realized how unjust that was. Also, there's something that we learn from Saint Therese, that Zelie taught her children to pray every single morning this very beautiful prayer. My God, I offer you my heart. Take it, if you like, in such a way that no one else might possess it, but you alone, my dear Jesus. So it wasn't just Louis and Zelie who had God at the heart of their lives, but all of their children. And that's something we can learn from them. If we want our own families to grow holy, we need to really consider, how do we spend our family time? Yes, it's important to go out to work. Sometimes we need to work very long hours. But we also need to spend time together. We need to pray together, have quality time, listening to each other, having fun times together, meaningful times together. Today it can be very easy just to get absorbed. I've seen groups of families where every single member of the family seems to be on a mobile phone. I don't know what sort of relationship is being built there. So, like, if we can't talk to the people that we're physically present with, I don't know how well we're going to really be talking to the people that we're not physically present with. So we think about our family habits. Those are the people that God has given to us. There may be some habits that we have that are unconscious, some good ones, some bad ones, but it's important to be aware of them and to talk to each other about what are our habits and how is it that we as a family might be growing holy together. After 6 years of marriage, Louis and Zelie had 4 girls, Marie, Pauline, Leonie and Hélène. 4 beautiful girls. The family was happy, but also there were always struggles. The girls had quite weak health in general. I won't go into all of the details, but we will see that this family went through very many trials and struggles, and there's something that we can all learn from and see how they dealt with them. And so then we can perhaps reflect on how we deal with the sufferings and trials that we are asked to face. So in 1865, after they'd been married for about 7 years, Zelie had the first signs of cancer. She noticed that there was a lump in her breast. And there was a possibility of having an operation, but she didn't go through with it. We're not exactly sure why, but it's also true that around that same time her father-in-law died. He was a holy man, as I'd said earlier. And that really actually very much struck Zelie, and she was had difficulty with it, and she's reflected on it, she said, I am terrified of death. So there's something we can really learn from Zelie, that she's Saint Zelie, yet she went through this time of deep unhappiness. I suppose who wouldn't be unhappy? And there's something else that we can learn, that being a saint doesn't mean being joyful at every single moment or having doesn't mean having total emotional composure. Or it doesn't mean just only speaking God's praises and just praying all day long. Sometimes we think that being sad or unhappy goes against being Christian, that somehow it goes against being holy. Zelie was very emotional and she got very upset, but she was a kind of nice saint. She was very aware of her sorrow and she feared being sorrowful, but mysteriously, it was actually a very significant part of her life over the next 5 years. 4 of her own children, as well as her own father, would die in those next 4 years. In September of 1866, her first boy was born, Joseph. So at that point for Zelie, that was actually pretty amazing. She was very happy to have a boy. But unfortunately, she couldn't nurse her own children. There was no bottled milk, no pasteurization, no refrigeration, and for whatever reason she wasn't able to nurse him, and so she had to send him away to a wet nurse. It was quite a common thing to do. And even though the wet nurse was only a few kilometres away, it was actually a very long way for somebody who couldn't drive. There were no cars, and she had 4 other small children. She would still go and visit him twice a day. And she said, oh, what a beautiful little boy that I have. He's so big and strong. If you knew how I love my little Joseph, I believe my fortune is made. It's also known that she dreamt of making him a lace alb for what she perceived that he would have his priestly ordination. That was in November, and just a few months later they received a call, come quickly, your child is ill. Unfortunately, the poor boy wasted away, and just a couple of months later he died. And their second boy was born about a year later, and again his life was very short. So even though child death was sadly very common at that time, that doesn't mean that it was easy for anybody. They lost 2 children, and that would be painful for anybody. Despite that very real pain, Zelie's way of life was really a profound experience of accepting God's will, and that's something that she had so ingrained. And as she mourned her son's death, it is known that she said, oh my God, must I put him in the ground? but since you will it, your will be done. Sounds a little bit like Jesus in Gethsemane. And the following year, Zelie's own father died, and she was numb with pain. And at the time she was pregnant, she feared for the life of her unborn child. But that child was Celine, and she would actually live a very long life and would be the last of the family to die in 1954 at the age of 90. So in 1870, their 5-year-old daughter Hélène, who was their 4th child, she picked up a virus and died within about 24 hours. So if that wasn't enough, at that point they had a newborn child, Melanie, and unfortunately the woman who was her wet nurse totally ignored her and effectively allowed her to starve to death. So they lost 2 daughters just in the same year. So by the end of 1870, Louis and Zelie had been married for 12 and a half years. They'd had 8 children, but 4 had died. So it's pretty a lot of suffering that they were asked to go through. And interestingly, Zelie courageously asked God for another child. And aren't we glad that she did? So their last child, their 9th child, is Saint Therese. She was born 2.5 years later, on the 2nd of January, 1873. So what can we learn from the Martin family? I think that the most fundamental thing that we learn from them is that God's will is law. That doesn't mean that we won't go through sufferings and that sufferings aren't painful, but it also means that when we suffer, we don't have a reason to be angry with God. Certainly Louis and Zelie didn't think so. We might think they had a reason to be angry with all of the difficulties that they'd been through, and also the difficult situation in France of all the political uncertainty and strife that was happening at that same time. But ultimately, they knew that it was all in God's will, one way or another. And they also knew that you can't just accept God's will for good things or for the things that you like and not for others. It doesn't work like that. They surrendered their whole lives to God's will. And we'll see here, specifically at the end of Zelie's life and also Louis in his own, that whatever the circumstances, whatever trials God asks you to face, if we stick with him, we will be rewarded. Perhaps not in this life. And this is what we can learn from Zelie. She had a very strong sense. One time she heard somebody boasting about material wealth, and she commented, "It is certain and proven by experience that happiness is not on earth. No, happiness can't be found here below, and it's a bad sign when things go well." In his wisdom, God wanted it this way to make us remember that the world is not our true home. I think Zelie had that very deeply interiorized in her heart, and as the years went by and she got sicker and sicker with her cancer, and eventually it was terminal. So at a certain point in early 1877, the doctor, the only thing he could suggest to her was that she needed a miracle. So she went on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. And as I said before, Zelie hated travelling. She didn't like the idea of going on a pilgrimage, but she knew that that was really her only possibility. And so she decided to do it properly. She took her 3 eldest daughters, and she went on an official pilgrimage group. It was not easy. There were problems from start to finish with the travel, with the accommodation, and ultimately she went into the waters at Lourdes and she did not get healed. She knew that it's a bad sign when things go well. Therefore, when things go badly, that's a good sign. She went home at peace. She was the one that had to comfort her daughters on the train ride back home. She was immersed in grace. She'd done everything, but God hadn't wanted her to be healed. And it was as if she heard the Virgin's words to Saint Bernadette: "I do not promise you happiness in this life, but in the next." And ultimately, suffering is a universal experience. Zelie was able to perceive that it can actually be a great privilege to have personal suffering, but that it's not actually very easy, but it is admirable. We have to live on this earth with all of its challenges, but we must never forget that heaven is our true home. So Zelie was accepting her death, and she actually continued to work right up until the end. She made lace, even almost to her dying day. But as she was dying, she instructed Louis, "I want you to not torment yourself over my death. I want you to resign yourself to the will of God." So on the 28th of August 1877, Louis Martin became the widowed father of 5 girls under 18. The youngest was 4 and a half, that was Therese. And the word I think that we can then describe, the word that we can use to describe Louis's life was sacrifice. This is what he did, and it was also well observed by others. And his eldest daughter said, "For our sakes, he would make any possible sacrifice. If necessary, he would sacrifice his happiness, even his life, to make us happy. He would stop at nothing." So he accepted Zelie's brother's invitation to move to Lisieux so that the two families could be together in the same town. And that was a sacrifice for him, but he did it out of love. He had to leave his friends, his business, everything really that he knew, but he went with his daughters and he willingly made that sacrifice. So, and despite all the grief that he was living, he actually continued to have a very happy and ordered life with his daughters, having God at the heart of everything. And so they had a great routine, just as always. And there's a biography which reads that idleness was ruthlessly banished. Study, needlework, and accomplishments filled every moment of the day. The girls learnt to look after their things. They had quite an austere lifestyle, but that doesn't mean that they were in pain all the time. There was actually a lot of fruit. And because of their deep faith, they all knew that they had many intercessors in heaven, their mother and their siblings. And in fact, one of the daughters, Leonie, had always been a very problematic child. She started to change a lot after her mother's death. And so it was a great joy for the family to see that. And they would all play together. The joy continued that they'd always had. So there they were in Lisieux, at that point a very unknown town. But of course we know that it's home to probably the most famous Carmel in the world. Well, that's what it would become. And that was the Carmel that began to attract Louis's daughters. So 5 years after Zelie's death, the second eldest daughter, Pauline, would enter in 1882, and then she was followed by Marie, the eldest daughter, and ultimately by Therese in 1888. So the entry of each of these daughters into the convent was basically as an offering to God. Louis knew that it was an offering. He offered them. He told God that he wanted to suffer for him, so he also offered himself. Despite having that attitude, it wasn't easy. He was aware of making these sacrifices, and he told his daughters that, but he was willing to make those sacrifices for the happiness of each of them and for the glory of God. As they entered, I think it was soon after Therese's entry, Louis's health started to deteriorate. He had always had good health, and then he had a stroke, and then he had seizures. He started to have amnesia, hallucinations even. He was fearing for his daughters, this very difficult situation in France. He wanted to escape from the world, and one day he disappeared for 4 days. These attacks continued, and Isidore, Zelie's brother, saw no other solution than to put him into a mental institution. So although Louis was going through very serious mental difficulties, he was actually also pretty lucid. And when he was asked at a certain point what was his experience on being in this institution, he said, "I know why God has given me this trial. I have never had a humiliation in my life. I needed one." Those are interesting words if we think about the life that he has had. And also, when his daughters told him that they were praying to St. Joseph for a cure, he said, "Don't do that. We must only pray that God's will be done." So even during his time of great mental difficulty, the same rules that had ruled his whole life were still very much there. May God's will be done. And he was known to be a very saintly man in that institution. He was very gentlemanly, he was very devoted to God, he spent many hours in the chapel. After being there for about 3 years, he was able to be released, and he went home and was able to die peacefully in his daughter Celine's arms on July the 29th of 1894. He was aged 70. So Saint Therese was the first to exclaim the holiness of her parents' lives. There are a couple who are more worthy of heaven than of earth. but they strove to live their ordinary lives on this earth in an extraordinary fashion. They didn't become holy in spite of being married and having children, but precisely through their marriage. God's will was at the heart of their lives. They are a wonderful testimony that the universal calling to holiness is not about being a religious or a priest. It's not about being on your knees all day long. It's really just about following God's will in everything. I hope you will all be encouraged and inspired by them to do the will of God in all things. Since Therese, Zelie and Louis Martin, pray for us.